Hey everyone, welcome back. I'm fully aware that for a lot of you, my voice is the last thing you hear before you fall asleep. So, before you're out cold, I thought it would be cool if you left a comment telling me what part of the world you're in. And of course, if you like what we do here, please like and subscribe. Now, sit back, relax. In this new story, what rangers found in the snow will shock you. The northern wilderness is a vast and unforgiving expanse that keeps its secrets buried deep beneath the ice. It is a place where mistakes are fatal, and the silence of the forest can drive a person to the brink. In the winter of 2022, a pair of rangers stumbled upon a mystery that defied all logic. What they found out there in the frozen wasteland was not just a tragedy, but a chilling puzzle. The events of that day would remain classified for months before finally being leaked to the public through redacted reports. This is the story of a patrol that started like any other and ended with a discovery that still haunts the local community. The official records state that the weather was clear and the visibility was perfect when the team set out that morning. Ranger Colton Rigg adjusted the strap of his heavy pack and looked out over the endless sea of white powder. He had been working in the Silver Creek territory for over 15 years and thought he had seen everything the mountain could throw at him. His partner for the day was a younger ranger named Marisol Vance, who had transferred from a coastal unit the previous autumn. Marisol was sharp and eager to prove herself, but she lacked the bone-deep instinct that only comes from years in the high country. They were tasked with a routine sweep of the northern boundary line to check for avalanche risks and illegal trapping activity. The snow was packed hard from a recent storm, which made for decent travel conditions on their heavy-duty snowmobiles. Colton signaled for Marisol to start her engine, and the roar of the machines shattered the morning calm. They rode for 2 hours through dense pine forests, where the trees were bowed low under the weight of the accumulated snow. The air was crisp and bit at any exposed skin, so they kept their face masks pulled tight and their goggles down. Colton led the way and navigated the winding trails that he knew by heart, even when they were buried under 3 feet of drift. They stopped at the halfway point to check in with dispatch and to drink some hot coffee from their thermoses. The radio signal was spotty in this sector, and the static hissed loudly before the voice of the dispatcher crackled through the speaker. Colton reported their coordinates and confirmed that there were no signs of distress or fresh tracks in the area so far. They mounted up again and pushed further north into a valley that rarely saw sunlight during the winter months. It was in this shadowed valley that Marisol spotted something unusual glinting near the base of a sheer granite cliff face. She slowed her snowmobile and waved frantically at Colton to get his attention before pointing toward the anomaly in the distance. Colton circled back and brought his machine to a halt beside hers, so he could follow her line of sight. At first, he saw nothing but the jagged rocks and the smooth blanket of snow that covered the valley floor. Then he caught a brief flash of something metallic reflecting the weak sunlight that filtered through the gray clouds above. It looked out of place in such a remote area where no vehicles or hikers were supposed to be during this season. They killed the engines, and the sudden silence that descended on the valley felt heavy and oppressive. Colton pulled his binoculars from his vest and focused the lenses on the object that was partially buried in a snowbank. It appeared to be the corner of a structure or perhaps a large vehicle that had been consumed by an avalanche. He lowered the glasses and looked at Marisol with a frown because there were no roads for miles in any direction. They decided to approach on foot to avoid triggering any unstable snow that might be resting on the slopes above the site. They strapped on their snowshoes and grabbed their avalanche probes and shovels from the storage racks on the back of the sleds. The hike over the uneven terrain was grueling, and the snow was deep enough to swallow a person to the waist. As they got closer, the shape of the object became clearer, and it was definitely man-made and rectangular in form. It looked like a shipping container that had been painted white to blend in with the surrounding winter landscape. The paint was chipped and peeling in places, which revealed rusted metal underneath that suggested it had been there for a long time. Colton signaled for Marisol to stay back while he moved forward to inspect the perimeter for any signs of movement or traps. He used his probe to check the snow depth around the container and found that it was resting on solid ground. There were no footprints leading to or from the site, which meant that no one had visited in quite a while. The snow had drifted high against the side of the metal box and completely obscured any doors or windows that might exist. They began to dig, and the sound of their shovels scraping against the metal echoed loudly in the quiet valley. It took them nearly 20 minutes of hard labor to clear enough snow to reveal a heavy steel door. The door was secured with a heavy padlock that was rusted shut and looked like it had not been opened in years. Colton retrieved a pair of bolt cutters from his pack and positioned the jaws around the shackle of the old lock. With a grunt of effort, he squeezed the handles together, and the metal snapped with a sharp crack that rang out like a gunshot. He pulled the broken lock free and let it drop into the snow before reaching for the handle of the door. Marisol stood ready with her bear spray and a flare gun just in case something wild had made a den inside. The door groaned on its hinges as Colton pulled it open, and a stale smell of stagnant air drifted out to meet them. He clicked on his heavy flashlight and swept the beam into the darkness of the container to reveal a shocking sight. It was not a storage unit or a trash dump, but a fully furnished living space that was frozen in time. There was a small cot in the corner with a sleeping bag rolled out and a pillow that looked yellow with age. A wooden table sat in the center of the room, covered in papers and maps that were curled at the edges from the cold. Shelves lined the walls, and they were stocked with rows of canned food and jars of water that had frozen and cracked. It looked like a survival bunker that someone had prepared with great care and then simply abandoned without a trace. Colton stepped inside, and the floorboards creaked under his weight as he moved toward the table to examine the papers. Marisol followed him and kept her light trained on the dark corners of the room to ensure they were truly alone. The temperature inside the container was even colder than the air outside, and their breath misted heavily in the beams of their lights. On the table, there was a logbook that lay open to a page that was covered in dense handwriting. The ink was faded but legible, and the dates written in the margins went back to the year 1998. Colton felt a chill run down his spine as he realized this place had been here for over 2 decades without detection. He picked up the book carefully and began to read the final entry, which was dated November the 5th of that year. The entry described a severe storm that was moving in, and the writer mentioned hearing strange noises outside the metal walls at night. The writing became erratic near the bottom of the page and spoke of a fear that someone was watching from the ridge. Colton handed the book to Marisol and turned his attention to a map that was pinned to the wall above the desk. The map showed the Silver Creek territory, but it was marked with red ink in several locations that made no sense to him. There were circles drawn around areas that were deep in the restricted zone, where civilians were absolutely forbidden to go. One of the circles was labeled with the word extraction and a date that corresponded to the day after the final journal entry. Marisol called out from the other side of the room where she had found a loose floorboard near the foot of the cot. She pried the wood up with the edge of her shovel and revealed a hidden compartment that was lined with plastic. Inside the hole was a waterproof case that looked brand new compared to the rest of the decaying items in the room. Colton walked over and knelt beside her as she undid the latches on the case and lifted the lid. Inside, they found a collection of items that did not belong in 1998 and shattered their theory of the timeline. There was a digital camera that looked to be a model from only a few years ago and a modern GPS unit. Colton picked up the GPS and pressed the power button to see if the batteries still held any charge after sitting in the cold. The screen flickered to life, which meant that someone had been here recently, and the bunker was not abandoned after all. He checked the track log and saw that the device had traveled from the town at the base of the mountain to this location just 3 days ago. The realization hit him hard that they were standing in the active hideout of someone who was likely still in the area. He looked at Marisol and saw the same dawn of understanding in her eyes as she gripped her flare gun tighter. They needed to leave immediately and report this to the federal authorities who handled cases of fugitives on public land. As they turned to exit the container, Colton noticed something on the back of the steel door that he had missed earlier. Scratched into the paint was a series of numbers that looked like coordinates and a name that he recognized from the news. It was the name of a bank robber who had vanished with a massive sum of money in the year 2005. The FBI had searched for the man for years, but the trail had gone cold and he was presumed dead or out of the country. If this was his hideout, then the money might still be here, and the man himself could be watching them right now. Colton pushed Marisol gently toward the exit and told her to move fast and keep her head on a swivel. They stepped back out into the blinding white of the snow, and the valley felt much more hostile than it had before. The wind had picked up and was blowing spin drifts of snow off the peaks, which reduced the visibility across the open ground. They retraced their steps to the snowmobiles and constantly scanned the tree line for any sign of movement or a silhouette against the trees. Colton felt a prickle on the back of his neck that told him eyes were fixed on them from somewhere high above. They reached the sleds and fumbled with the keys because their hands were shaking from the adrenaline and the biting cold. Colton started his engine, and the noise felt dangerously loud in the quiet valley as he waited for Marisol to start hers. Just as Marisol turned her key, a loud crack echoed off the canyon walls that sounded distinctively different from the shifting ice. It was the sharp report of a rifle, and a puff of snow kicked up just inches from the front ski of her machine. Colton screamed at her to go and jammed his throttle forward to speed away from the exposed position near the cliff base. They raced across the valley floor and zigzagged their path to make themselves harder targets for whoever was firing from the ridge. Another shot rang out, but it went wide and buried itself in a snowbank far to their left as they hit the tree line. They did not stop until they were miles away and back on the main trail that led toward the ranger station. When they finally reached the safety of the outpost, they called in every agency that would listen and locked the doors tight. A tactical team arrived by helicopter within the hour, and Colton led them back to the coordinates of the buried container. The team approached the site with weapons drawn and surrounded the metal box before breaching the door with a battering ram. The container was empty of people just as the Rangers had left it, but there was one significant change. The waterproof case that held the camera and the GPS unit was gone, and the loose floorboard had been replaced. The map on the wall had been ripped down, and the logbook was missing from the wooden table where they had left it. The investigators combed the area for days, but the falling snow had wiped away any tracks that the shooter might have left behind. They found a sniper nest on the ridge overlooking the valley that contained a single spent shell casing and a wrapper from a protein bar. The wrapper was from a brand that was only sold in a specific chain of stores in the nearest city. It was clear that the occupant of the bunker had been close by when Colton and Marisol had first arrived. He had likely watched them break into his home and decided to scare them off rather than kill federal officers. The identity of the man remains a subject of debate, but the evidence points to the missing fugitive from 2005. The shock of the discovery was not just in the items found, but in the realization of how close they had come to death. The Rangers had walked into the lair of a desperate man who had managed to survive in the wild for nearly 20 years. He had lived right under the noses of the patrol teams and used their own predictable schedules to avoid detection. The bunker was later removed by a heavy-lift helicopter, and the site was returned to its natural state to discourage sightseers. Colton and Marisol were commended for their discovery, but neither of them ever returned to patrol that specific valley again. The memory of that rifle shot and the feeling of being hunted in the snow was something that would never fade. One detail that was never released to the public was the content of the photos on the digital camera before it was taken. Marisol had briefly scrolled through the images while Colton was checking the GPS unit inside the bunker that day. She saw pictures of the ranger station taken from the woods and photos of the Rangers themselves walking to their cars. The man had not just been hiding in the mountains, he had been actively stalking the people who were supposed to be watching the land. It was a violation of their safety that made every shadow in the forest look like a threat for years to come. The wilderness is vast, and it is easy to disappear if a person is willing to leave their humanity behind. Some locals believe the man is still out there and has simply moved to a new sector of the forest that is even more remote. They say that when the wind blows through the canyons at night, you can hear the hum of a generator. Others think he fled the country with his money and finally left the cold darkness of the mountains for good. But Colton knows that a man who can survive 20 years in a metal box does not give up his territory easily. He watches the tree line a little closer now and always keeps his rifle within arm's reach when he is on patrol. The snow covers everything eventually, but it also has a way of revealing the truth when you least expect it. The story of the bunker in the valley serves as a grim reminder that we are never truly alone in the wild. There are eyes that watch from the ridges and secrets that are hidden beneath the layers of ice and time. For the rangers of Silver Creek, the winter season is no longer just about the cold and the avalanches. It is about the knowledge that someone else might be walking the same trails and leaving no footprints for them to follow. The mystery of the man in the snow remains unsolved and likely will be until the mountain decides to give him up. Until then, the patrols continue and the rangers keep their guard up against the silence of the frozen woods. The investigation file is officially open but inactive due to the lack of new leads or sightings in the area. The authorities hope that one day a hiker or a hunter will stumble across a clue that was missed. Perhaps a piece of equipment or a stash of money will surface when the spring thaw melts the snowpack. But for now, the case is just another ghost story that is told around the fire in the ranger station. It is a cautionary tale about curiosity and the dangers of digging too deep into things that were meant to remain buried. The snow keeps its counsel and the wind erases the past with every storm that rolls through the high peaks. Years later, Marisol would tell the story to the rookies she trained and warn them to trust their instincts above all else. She would describe the glint of metal in the valley and the smell of the stale air inside the container. She would tell them about the rifle shot and the fear that gripped her heart as they raced for the trees. It was a lesson in survival and the unpredictable nature of the job that they had signed up for. The wilderness demands respect and vigilance from those who dare to enter its domain. And sometimes the most dangerous thing in the forest is not a bear or a wolf, but a fellow human being. The legacy of that day lives on in the protocols that the rangers follow when they encounter strange structures in the wild. They no longer approach alone, and they always assume that a site is active until proven otherwise. The equipment they carry has been upgraded, and their training now includes tactical retreat scenarios. It was a hard lesson to learn, but it likely saved the lives of other rangers in the years that followed. The man in the snow changed the way they looked at the world and the job they loved. And in the end, that was the most shocking discovery of all. We may never know the full story of the man who lived in the box and watched the world from his frozen fortress. But his presence is felt in every storm and in every unexplained track that is found in the deep woods. He is a phantom of the Silver Creek territory and a legend that will outlive the metal walls of his bunker. The Rangers still patrol the northern boundary, but they do so with a wariness that was not there before. They know that the line between civilization and the wild is thin and easily crossed, and they know that some secrets are better left in the cold. This dashboard camera captured a figure miles from town. The desolate stretch of asphalt, known as United States Route 50, cuts through the heart of Nevada and has earned the moniker the loneliest road in America due to its vast, unpopulated distances. Arthur Reed was a 38-year-old heavy-haul transport specialist who had spent the last 15 years navigating the most remote highways in the western United States. Reed was employed by a logistics firm based in Salt Lake City that specialized in moving sensitive mining equipment to isolated extraction sites. He was known among his supervisors as a meticulous driver who strictly adhered to safety protocols and maintained his vehicle with obsessive care. On the night of August 12, 2023, Reed was tasked with transporting an oversized generator unit from a depot in Ely to a distribution center in Reno. The total weight of his rig exceeded 80,000 pounds, which required him to drive during off-peak hours to minimize traffic disruption. Dispatch logs from the trucking company confirm that Reed completed his pre-trip inspection at 2300 hours and departed the Ely yard shortly before midnight. The vehicle Reed was operating was a late-model Kenworth T680 equipped with a sophisticated telematics suite and a dual-lens dashboard camera system. The camera was designed to record high-definition video of the road ahead while simultaneously monitoring the driver for signs of fatigue or distraction. The system was hardwired into the truck's electronic control unit, which allowed it to tag video files with real-time data regarding speed and braking force. Reed merged onto Route 50 and set his cruise control to 55 miles per hour as he settled in for the long drive across the Great Basin Desert. The weather reports for that night indicated clear skies with unlimited visibility and an ambient temperature of 65 degrees. Reed later told investigators that the first 3 hours of the trip were completely uneventful, and he encountered fewer than 5 other vehicles during that time. He listened to satellite radio talk shows to stay alert as the endless line of reflector posts flashed by in the darkness. The incident occurred as Reed was approaching the Eureka County line near a geographic depression known as Antelope Valley at approximately 3:14 in the morning. The road in this section is characterized by long straightaways that can lull drivers into a state of highway hypnosis if they are not careful. However, the telemetry data from the truck's black box indicates that Reed was actively making micro adjustments to the steering wheel, which proves he was fully alert. The onboard radar system, which is designed to detect obstacles and automatically engage the brakes if a collision is imminent, suddenly issued a proximity warning. Reed stated that he heard the sharp, audible alarm from the dashboard a split second before his headlights illuminated a shape in the middle of the westbound lane. He instinctively slammed on the air brakes and disengaged the cruise control while gripping the steering wheel to maintain control of the massive load. The physics of stopping a fully loaded semi-truck on a 2-lane highway required Reed to manage the braking pressure carefully to avoid jackknifing the trailer. The tires screamed against the asphalt as the anti-lock braking system pulsed rapidly to prevent a skid. Reed reported seeing a figure standing directly on the double yellow line approximately 200 feet in front of his grill. The figure did not attempt to move or jump out of the way of the 40-ton vehicle hurtling toward it. Reed managed to steer the cab slightly onto the gravel shoulder to widen the gap between the truck and the obstacle. The truck came to a violent halt in a cloud of dust and burnt rubber, roughly 50 yards past the point where the figure had been standing. The cabin was silent except for the heavy breathing of the driver and the mechanical ticking of the cooling engine block. Reed sat frozen in the driver's seat for nearly a minute as he processed the near collision and waited for his heart rate to stabilize. He checked the side mirrors, expecting to see a confused pedestrian or a deer standing on the road behind the trailer. The view in the mirrors was pitch black, save for the red glow of the trailer clearance lights reflecting off the settling dust. Reed unbuckled his safety belt and retrieved a heavy-duty Maglite flashlight from the door storage compartment. He opened the cab door and stepped out onto the aluminum running board before jumping down to the gravel shoulder. The air outside was silent and smelled strongly of sagebrush and ozone from the braking friction. Reed swept the beam of his flashlight across the roadway and the surrounding desert scrub looking for the person he was sure he had almost killed. The driver conducted a thorough grid search of the immediate area for 20 minutes, walking back and forth along the asphalt and the dirt embankments. He looked for footprints in the soft sand on the shoulder that would indicate where the person had entered or exited the highway. According to Reed's statement to the police, there were no footprints anywhere near the site except for his own boot marks. The asphalt itself showed the heavy black skid marks from his tires, but there was no physical evidence of a pedestrian. Confused and unsettled, Reed returned to the cab and locked the doors before calling the authorities via his satellite phone. He reported a potential hazard on the roadway and requested a patrol unit to verify the area was safe. While he waited, he decided to access the onboard computer to review the footage. The dashboard camera system had a small display screen mounted on the windshield that allowed drivers to play back recent events. Reed navigated the menu to the timestamp of the hard braking event and pressed play on the video file. The footage was crisp and clear, showing the high beams cutting through the darkness of the desert night. At exactly 03:14 and 12 seconds, a pale shape appeared on the center line at the edge of the light's reach. Reed paused the video and used the digital zoom function to get a closer look at the anomaly. The figure appeared to be a human male of average height, wearing a gray suit that looked tailored in a style from the mid-20th century. The man was standing with his arms at his sides and his head turned slightly to the north, away from the oncoming truck. A Nevada Highway Patrol trooper arrived at the scene 45 minutes later, after being dispatched from the nearest substation in Austin. The trooper parked his cruiser behind Reed's truck and activated his emergency lights to warn any approaching traffic. He approached the cab and interviewed Reed, who was still visibly shaken by the experience. The officer recorded Reed's statement and then conducted his own inspection of the roadway using a high-powered spotlight. The The trooper also utilized a handheld thermal imaging camera to scan the surrounding desert for heat signatures. The thermal display showed the residual heat from the truck's tires and engine, but the desert itself was a uniform cool blue. There were no warm shapes, indicating a person hiding in the brush or walking away from the highway. Reed invited the trooper into the cab to view the dashboard camera footage to prove that he had not been hallucinating. The officer watched the video several times and agreed that there was undeniably a person standing in the lane. However, the trooper noticed a disturbing detail that Reed had missed during his initial panic. As the truck approached the figure, the bright LED headlights should have cast a long shadow behind the man stretching out into the darkness. The video showed that the figure cast absolutely no shadow on the asphalt despite being fully illuminated. The light seemed to pass through the space where the shadow should have been, or the figure simply did not interact with the light in a physical way. The officer noted this discrepancy in his field report, but could offer no logical explanation. The trooper cleared Reed to continue his journey after documenting the incident as a collision avoidance with an unknown object. Reed drove the remaining distance to Reno in a state of high anxiety, constantly scanning the road for the gray-suited man. He arrived at the distribution center shortly after sunrise and immediately reported the incident to his company's safety department. The safety manager downloaded the full-resolution video file from the truck's hard drive along with the telemetry data logs. The company launched an internal investigation to determine if the braking maneuver was justified or if it was the result of driver error. Corporate policy required a detailed analysis of any event that triggered the collision mitigation system to prevent insurance liability. The technical team at the logistics firm analyzed the footage frame by frame using professional video editing software. They concluded that the figure on the screen was likely a digital artifact or a compression error caused by the camera's image sensor. They argued that the lack of a shadow was definitive proof that the object was not physically real. The report suggested that a momentary glitch in the sensor array had created a cluster of pixels that resembled a human shape. They pointed out that the camera had been running for hours in a low-light environment, which can sometimes cause sensor noise. However, the maintenance records for the truck showed that the camera system had been installed brand new only 2 months prior to the trip. Furthermore, the radar data contradicted the glitch theory entirely. The collision mitigation system on the Kenworth truck used a millimeter-wave radar sensor mounted in the front bumper to detect physical objects. The telemetry logs revealed that the radar had locked onto a solid target at a distance of 300 feet. The system had calculated the time to impact and had initiated the braking sequence independently of the driver's reaction. This meant that the truck's computer had detected a physical mass on the road at the exact same location where the camera saw the figure. It is extremely rare for 2 independent sensor systems to malfunction simultaneously in a way that perfectly corroborates a false positive. The conflict between the visual evidence of a shadowless figure and the radar evidence of a solid object baffled the company engineers. Some locals in the historic mining towns along Route 50 have passed down stories of strange occurrences on that highway for decades. Archives from the Eureka Sentinel newspaper in the 1950s contain a brief article about a traveling salesman who vanished on that same stretch of road. The salesman was reportedly last seen wearing a gray business suit and driving a sedan that broke down near Antelope Valley. His car was found abandoned on the roadside with the keys in the ignition, but the man was never seen again. Investigators at the time found no evidence of foul play, and the case eventually went cold. While there is no direct link between the cold case and Reed's video, the description of the clothing bears a striking resemblance to the figure on the tape. The ambiguity of the dashboard camera footage led to intense debate within the online community of professional drivers. Reed shared a clip of the video on a private industry forum in an attempt to find answers or validation. Many veteran truckers commented that they had seen similar inexplicable things on Route 50, but had always dismissed them as fatigue. One user, who claimed to be a former optical engineer, offered a detailed critique of the glitch theory. He explained that a sensor glitch would typically appear as a geometric block of color or a streak rather than a detailed human silhouette. He also noted that the figure's perspective changed correctly as the truck moved closer, which suggests it was a three-dimensional object in the environment. The video was eventually leaked to a freelance investigative journalist who specialized in analyzing digital evidence of anomalous events. The journalist hired an independent video forensic expert to perform an enhancement on the raw footage. The expert adjusted the gamma levels and contrast to reveal details that were hidden in the deep blacks of the video. The enhanced footage revealed a second anomaly that neither Reed nor the police had noticed at the scene. Crouched low near a mile marker post on the left side of the road was a second, smaller figure that appeared to be watching the man in the suit. The second figure was blurry and indistinct, but its presence added a new layer of complexity to the incident. If the first figure was a glitch, it is statistically impossible for a second coordinated glitch to appear in the same frame. Reed was deeply disturbed by the discovery of the second figure and felt a retrospective sense of dread about getting out of the truck. He realized that while he was searching the darkness with his flashlight, he might have been observed by whatever was crouching by the road. The psychological impact of the event began to affect his ability to work night shifts. He requested a transfer to a local daytime delivery route in the Pacific Northwest to avoid the isolation of the desert highways. He eventually resigned from the logistics company in 2025, citing persistent insomnia and anxiety related to driving. Reed moved to a small coastal town in Oregon, where he opened a hardware store and tried to leave his life on the road behind. The scientific community generally dismisses such accounts as pareidolia, where the brain interprets random patterns as familiar objects. However, a group of researchers from a university in Nevada decided to test the optical conditions of the sighting in 2024. They obtained permission to close that section of Route 50 for one night to conduct a recreation. They placed a mannequin dressed in a gray suit on the center line at the exact coordinates recorded by Reed's truck. They drove a similar vehicle toward the mannequin at various speeds while recording with the same model of dashboard camera. The resulting footage showed that in every single pass, the mannequin cast a distinct, long shadow on the asphalt. The researchers were unable to replicate the shadowless effect seen in Reed's video using physical objects. The report from the university researchers concluded that the video was anomalous, but could not determine its origin. They suggested that if the video was not a fabrication, then it captured a phenomenon that defies the current understanding of optics. The lack of a shadow implies that the figure was either not solid or was emitting its own light that canceled out the shadows. However, the radar data confirms that the object was solid enough to reflect radar waves. This paradox remains the central point of contention for anyone who studies the case. The trucking company eventually sealed the full accident file and refused to release any further data, citing privacy concerns for their former employee. Arthur Reed still possesses a digital copy of the original raw video file on an encrypted hard drive in his home. He has refused lucrative offers from television production companies to license the footage for paranormal documentary series. He told a close friend that he does not want to sensationalize what happened because he believes it was a warning rather than a spectacle. The friend later posted on a forum that Reed is convinced the figure in the suit turned its head at the last possible second. Reed claims that although the camera resolution was too low to capture it, he saw the man's eyes through the windshield. He described them not as human eyes, but as reflective surfaces like those of a nocturnal predator caught in a spotlight. This detail is what keeps him awake at night more than the figure itself. The stretch of Route 50 near Antelope Valley remains open to traffic, and thousands of vehicles pass through it every year without incident. The tire marks from Reed's emergency stop have long since faded from the asphalt worn away by weather and time. The mystery of the shadowless man in the gray suit has become a modern legend among the long-haul truckers who drive the corridor. Some drivers claim that their radios fill with static when they pass that specific mile marker, while others report sudden drops in temperature. Whether these are genuine phenomena or merely the power of suggestion is impossible to say. The only concrete evidence that remains is a digital video file that shows a man standing where no man should be and a radar log that says something was there. In this new story, he thought the scratching was rats. It wasn't. In late autumn of 2014, strange noise complaints emerged from a secluded property in northern Maine. 32-year-old Arthur Pendleton lived alone and worked as a structural engineer evaluating old timber cabins. He initially dismissed the faint scraping sounds behind his drywall as common field mice seeking a winter shelter. County dispatch logs from November reveal a sudden escalation in his distress calls regarding the bizarre nighttime noises. What began as a mundane pest issue quickly evolved into an unresolved missing persons case lacking any explanation. Arthur had relocated to the Aroostook County region to study the architectural decay of several abandoned logging structures. His rented property was a refurbished two-story farmhouse situated roughly 14 miles away from the nearest town. For the first 3 weeks, state records indicate he maintained regular daily email contact with his Boston firm. Archived notes from his professional journals mention the surprising structural integrity of the local buildings he carefully surveyed. The surrounding dense forest provided a quiet environment for his highly technical and incredibly focused architectural assessment work. The engineer spent his early days driving a heavily modified utility truck across miles of unpaved dirt roads. He carried specialized measuring equipment designed to test the load-bearing capacity of century-old rotting wooden beams. The isolated farmhouse he rented served as a temporary base of operations for his extensive 3-month project. He reportedly chose this specific location because it offered quick access to deep forest trails and historic sites. Nobody in the nearby town knew much about his background or his ultimate reasons for taking the assignment. During his second week in the remote farmhouse, Arthur began noting minor acoustic anomalies in his daily journals. He wrote about a persistent, low-frequency vibration that seemed to echo through the solid oak floorboards nightly. A county file from 2009 indicated the property sat on naturally shifting soil prone to settling. Arthur initially attributed these subtle sounds to thermal expansion within the old wooden framing as temperatures dropped rapidly. However, his professional expertise soon led him to question the unusual rhythm and distinct origin of the noises. The subtle vibrations eventually transitioned into distinct scratching sounds originating from inside the primary ground floor exterior walls. Some locals claimed the old farmhouse had a long history of attracting large raccoons during the colder months. Arthur visited a small local hardware store and purchased several heavy-duty animal traps and strong chemical repellents. He strategically placed the metal cages around the concrete foundation and along the edges of the dark crawl space. He fully expected to capture a wild animal within a few days and resolve the annoying nighttime disturbance. 4 days passed without any success, and the heavy metal animal traps remained completely empty and undisturbed outside. The scratching noises continued to grow louder and more aggressive during the darkest hours of the early morning. Arthur documented how the sounds would often stop abruptly whenever he turned on a lamp or moved around. This cautious behavior struck him as highly unusual for simple rodents or common wild animals seeking winter warmth. He began keeping a heavy steel flashlight near his bed to investigate the walls whenever the scratching started. By the end of the 3rd week, the situation took a distinctly unnerving turn inside the isolated home. Arthur realized the scratching sounds were no longer confined to a single spot near the old stone fireplace. The noises actively tracked his physical movements as he walked slowly across the long wooden bedroom floor at night. He tested this theory by pacing from the window to the door and listening to the corresponding movement. Investigators never confirmed if multiple animals were present, but Arthur firmly believed something was intentionally following his steps. His growing anxiety pushed him to conduct a thorough daylight inspection of the entire property exterior and foundation. He walked around the perimeter with a digital camera and documented several strange markings near the rear entrance. He found deep vertical gouges in the wooden siding located nearly 6 feet above the soft, damp ground. The freshly exposed wood indicated the severe damage had occurred sometime during the previous heavy rainstorm that week. He immediately recognized the alarming height and sheer force required to create such deep markings in solid timber. Arthur contacted the local sheriff department and requested an officer visit the property to document the disturbing vandalism. The responding deputy noted the severe anxiety in Arthur's voice and spent an hour examining the exterior damage. The officer suggested a large black bear standing on its hind legs might be responsible for the gouges. However, a detailed search of the surrounding soft mud revealed absolutely no animal tracks or displaced vegetation anywhere. Arthur politely dismissed the bear theory and pointed out the precise and almost calculated nature of the scratching. The following night, the scratching sounds migrated from the ground floor walls to the ceiling directly above him. Arthur described the noise in his audio logs as heavy objects dragging across the exposed second-floor joists. The farmhouse had a small, unfinished attic space accessible only through a narrow wooden panel in the hallway. He spent hours staring at the ceiling and tracking the slow, methodical movements shifting above his living room. He recorded over 40 minutes of audio, capturing the undeniable sound of heavy weight pressing on the drywall. His Boston contracting firm received a final email from Arthur on the morning of November 22nd. He requested an emergency leave of absence and attached several heavily distorted audio files of the ceiling noises. The firm manager tried calling his cell phone multiple times, but only received automated out-of-service messages. The cellular reception in the deep Aroostook County woods was notoriously unreliable during heavy autumn wind and rainstorms. Arthur was entirely cut off from the outside world while trapped inside the echoing walls of the farmhouse. The strange noises reached a terrifying peak later that evening when a violent thunderstorm hit the rural area. Arthur sat at his kitchen table and recorded a final entry in his personal digital audio journal device. He calmly explained that the scratching had evolved into frantic clawing directly above his primary first-floor bedroom. He noted the structural groaning of the ceiling panels indicated whatever was up there weighed over 200 pounds. He expressed a deep, rational fear that the drywall would eventually collapse under the immense shifting physical weight. Desperation finally forced Arthur to make a second emergency call to the county dispatch center at midnight. He spoke in a harsh whisper and explained that an unknown intruder was currently trapped inside his attic. The dispatcher logged the call and immediately categorized it as an active home invasion requiring an urgent response. Arthur stayed on the phone and provided a highly detailed description of the ongoing frantic clawing sounds above. He explicitly stated the noise did not sound like any animal he had ever encountered in the woods. The audio recording of the emergency call captures the exact moment Arthur made a terrible and fatal decision. He told the dispatcher he was tired of waiting and intended to look through the hallway access panel. The dispatcher repeatedly ordered him to stay inside a locked room and wait for the armed deputies to arrive. Arthur ignored the strict instructions and stated he was simply going to shine his heavy flashlight up there. The call captured the sound of a chair sliding across the floor before disconnecting abruptly into total silence. Multiple law enforcement vehicles arrived at the secluded farmhouse exactly 45 minutes after the dropped emergency call. The heavy rain had washed away any potential footprints on the long gravel driveway leading to the property. They found the front door standing wide open, swinging violently in the harsh wind of the passing storm. Arthur's modified utility truck was still parked outside, and his wallet and keys were sitting on the table. The interior of the house was completely dark, silent, and showed no obvious signs of a physical struggle. Deputies drew their weapons and conducted a slow, tactical sweep of the entire ground floor and exterior perimeter. They found the kitchen and bedroom completely undisturbed, with Arthur's computer still running a structural analysis software program. However, they soon discovered the wooden attic access panel in the central hallway had been pushed completely open. A heavy wooden dining chair was positioned directly underneath the dark rectangular hole leading into the ceiling space. The deputies gathered beneath the opening and called out for Arthur, but received absolutely no verbal response back. One officer climbed onto the chair and slowly raised his tactical flashlight into the pitch-black attic space. He immediately spotted Arthur's heavy steel flashlight slowly rolling across the exposed wooden floorboards near the ventilation shaft. The officer carefully pulled himself into the cramped space and began crawling across the thick pink fiberglass insulation. The air inside the attic was incredibly cold and smelled strongly of decaying damp wood and raw copper. He signaled for backup as he discovered highly disturbing physical evidence scattered around the central load-bearing beam. Records conflict regarding what exactly the investigating officers discovered near the main ventilation shaft at the far end. Some official police reports state the officers found an old, filthy sleeping bag and several empty food cans. This mundane evidence strongly suggested an unknown transient individual had been secretly living directly above Arthur's bedroom. The squatter theory perfectly explained the heavy footsteps, the moving sounds, and the missing food from the kitchen. However, other highly confidential sources from the investigation claimed the physical evidence was much more sinister and ambiguous. A secondary forensic report described finding human fingernails deeply embedded in the wooden beams near the ventilation grate. The report suggested someone had been frantically clawing at the floorboards from inside the attic for several days. This terrifying detail aligned perfectly with Arthur's detailed audio logs describing the desperate scratching sounds above his head. Investigators found long strands of unidentified dark hair snagged on the sharp, rusty nails protruding from the roof. Whatever had been hiding up there had seemingly vanished into the stormy night without leaving a clear trail. The state police immediately launched a massive search effort through the surrounding dense timberland the very next morning. They established a command center at the property and brought in heavily trained tracking dogs to scour the woods. The dogs reportedly lost the scent completely less than 100 yards away from the farmhouse back door. They also utilized thermal imaging helicopters to scan miles of dense forest canopy for any signs of body heat. Despite the massive allocation of resources and manpower, they found absolutely no trace of the missing structural engineer. The property remained heavily scrutinized by forensics teams for the next 14 days without yielding any definitive answers. The deep gouges on the exterior siding were re-examined and matched the exact width of a large human hand. The heavy scratching Arthur heard was undeniably a person physically tearing at the architecture of the isolated house. The identity of the potential squatter and their disturbing motive for tormenting the isolated man remains completely unknown. No fingerprints matching anyone in the National Criminal Database were ever recovered from the dusty attic floorboards. Arthur's abandoned audio journals were eventually transcribed and added to the massive unresolved missing persons case file. Audio experts analyzed the recordings of the ceiling noises, but could not identify any specific spoken words or breathing. The deep, rhythmic thumping captured on the digital device continues to baffle sound engineers and law enforcement officials today. Some analysts suggest the acoustics of the old house amplified the movements of a relatively small person hiding above. Others believe the terrifying recordings capture something much larger, moving with deliberate and malicious intent in the dark. The Boston contracting firm officially terminated Arthur's employment contract 3 months after his mysterious and sudden disappearance. His remaining family members traveled to Maine to collect his personal belongings and abandoned professional surveying equipment. They reported feeling an overwhelming sense of dread while standing inside the quiet and empty rural farmhouse property. The landlord eventually boarded up the windows and securely padlocked the doors, leaving the building to slowly decay. The property quickly earned a dark reputation among locals who actively avoid driving down that specific dirt road. Years passed, and the dense Maine forest slowly began to reclaim the forgotten farmhouse and the overgrown driveway. Hunters occasionally report hearing strange, rhythmic thumping noises echoing from the direction of the abandoned two-story structure. Some adventurous teenagers broke into the house in 2019, but fled after hearing heavy footsteps upstairs. Police responded to their trespassing call, but found the interior completely empty and the attic access panel sealed shut. The legend of the scratching in the walls continues to grow and terrify the small surrounding rural community. Today, the state records officially list Arthur Pendleton as an active missing person with 0 new leads generated. Investigators never confirmed if he panicked and fled into the freezing woods or was taken by the unknown intruder. The truth regarding what he actually saw when he shined his flashlight into that dark attic remains a mystery. The case serves as a chilling reminder of the deep isolation found in the remote corners of northern Maine. Whoever or whatever was hiding in the ceiling space that cold November night has never been identified or caught. In this new story, what happened inside this frozen Appalachian cabin will shock you. The dense forests of the Appalachian mountain range are known for swallowing secrets and hiding them under layers of heavy winter snow. This story examines the official case file of a missing person and the disturbing evidence found inside his isolated home. Silas Thorne was a 62-year-old man who had spent his entire adult life working near the timberline. He served as a fire lookout for 30 years and chose to retire in a cabin built on the Devil Ridge. The local rangers described Silas as a man of extreme discipline who kept his living quarters in a state of military order. On the morning of January 4th, 2022, a massive low-pressure system collided with the mountain peaks. Meteorologists predicted that the storm would bring wind chills of 40 degrees below zero and nearly 5 feet of snow. Silas contacted the dispatch tower at 8 in the morning to confirm he was hiking down to the main trailhead. He told the operator that his radio batteries were draining unusually fast, and he wanted to get below the storm line. The dispatch logs show that the operator advised Silas to stay inside the cabin if the visibility dropped below 50 yards. Silas replied that he could already see the clouds descending, and he signed off with his standard call sign and code. That was the last time anyone heard a human voice transmit from the cabin on the top of Devil Ridge. The storm raged for 9 straight days and buried the access roads under drifts that were impossible for trucks to pass. A supply driver named Arthur Vance waited at the bottom of the trail for 2 hours on that first Tuesday afternoon. Arthur stated in his police report that the woods were silent and he felt a strange pressure in his ears. He honked his horn several times, but the sound seemed to be absorbed by the thick white mist falling from above. Arthur eventually returned to the town and filed a missing person report with the county sheriff the very next morning. The authorities could not launch a rescue mission until the weather system finally broke on the 14th of January. A specialized search and rescue team was assembled at dawn, and they used heavy snowmobiles to navigate the buried logging roads. The team was led by a veteran ranger named Miller, who had known Silas personally for more than 20 years. They reached the base of the ridge around noon and had to proceed on foot using snowshoes and climbing gear. Miller later wrote in his official incident report that the forest around the cabin looked different than the rest of the mountain. The bark on the pine trees had been stripped away on the side facing the cabin as if blasted by sand. The cabin itself stood dark against the white snow, and the front door was standing wide open to the freezing wind. Miller signaled for his team to hold their positions while he approached the porch with his weapon drawn and ready. He shouted for Silas, but the only sound was the wind whistling through the open doorway and into the dark interior. The team entered the structure and found the main room buried under 3 feet of fine and powdery-driven snow. They expected to find the frozen body of Silas Thorne somewhere in the drift, but the room appeared to be empty. Investigating officers began to clear the snow carefully to avoid disturbing any potential evidence that might be hidden on the floor. They uncovered the kitchen table and found a scene that suggested Silas had been interrupted in the middle of a routine. A bowl of beef stew sat on the table, and the liquid was frozen into a solid block of brown ice. A metal spoon was resting in the bowl, but the handle was bent backward at a complete 90-degree angle. Miller noted that it would take significant force to bend a piece of steel cutlery in such a precise manner. The The team continued their sweep of the small living space and found Silas's heavy winter coat hanging on the wall hook. His insulated boots were sitting on the stone hearth of the fireplace, and they were dry and cold to the touch. This discovery immediately escalated the concern of the team because no experienced woodsman would leave without his gear in a storm. The temperature inside the cabin was 5 degrees below zero, and survival time without protective clothing would be measured in minutes. A junior deputy named Kowalski found a spiral notebook sitting on the nightstand next to the narrow bed in the corner. The notebook contained the daily weather logs that Silas kept as a habit from his days as a professional fire lookout. The handwriting in the first half of the book was neat and precise, with clear notations of wind speed and temperature. The entries for the final week showed a marked deterioration in the penmanship, and the sentences became difficult to read. On January 2nd, Silas wrote that the birds had stopped singing and the forest had gone completely silent in the afternoon. The entry for January 3rd described a low humming sound that seemed to vibrate the floorboards of the cabin all night. Silas wrote that the sound was making his teeth ache, and he could feel the fillings in his molars vibrating. The final written entry was scrawled on the morning of his disappearance, and it simply said, "The light is wrong today." Kowalski bagged the notebook as evidence and continued to search the area around the bed for any other personal items. He looked under the bed frame and discovered a small handheld digital audio recorder that was covered in a layer of dust. The device was powered off, but the batteries still held enough charge to play back the files stored on the memory. Miller gathered the team in the center of the room and pressed the play button to listen to the final logs. The first file was dated January 3rd and captured the sound of Silas pacing back and forth on the wooden floor. He spoke into the microphone and said he was recording this because he did not trust his own eyes anymore. Silas described seeing shapes moving in the tree line that looked like tall, pale men standing perfectly still in the snow. He said they were too tall to be human, and their arms hung down past their knees in an unnatural way. The recording picked up a low-frequency thrumming noise that caused the speaker on the digital recorder to crackle and distort. The second audio file was recorded at 3 in the morning on the day Silas was supposed to hike down. The voice on the tape was barely a whisper, and Silas sounded like he was hiding in the corner of the room. He said the visitors were on the porch, and he could hear them running their fingernails along the exterior siding. The recorder captured a sharp scratching sound that moved from the left side of the stereo field to the right side. It sounded like hard ceramic dragging against soft wood, and it continued for nearly 4 minutes without any pause or rhythm. Silas whispered that the thermal glass in the windows was vibrating, and he could see a blue light seeping through the cracks. He said the light did not cast any shadows, and it made the air inside the cabin smell like burning ozone. The team listened in silence as the scratching on the tape suddenly stopped and was replaced by a heavy thudding on the roof. The sound was heavy enough to shake the dust from the rafters, and it sounded like something massive had landed above. Silas let out a shaky breath and said they were trying to come down the chimney to get inside the room. The final recording was only 10 seconds long, and the timestamp showed it was made just minutes before the scheduled radio call. The audio was filled with the sound of the wind roaring, but the door sounded like it was being ripped open. Silas shouted one final word that sounded like clay before the recording cut to static and the device turned itself off. Miller ordered the team to inspect the fireplace and the chimney based on the terrifying commentary from the audio logs. The hearth was cold and the flue was closed, but the team noticed a strange gray substance leaking from the damper. They used a crowbar to pry open the iron damper, and a massive amount of wet gray mud spilled into the room. The mud was heavy and smelled distinctly of stagnant water and decaying plant matter from the bottom of a riverbed. The team collected samples of the mud and later sent them to the state crime lab for a detailed geological analysis. The lab results confirmed that the mud was a specific type of sedimentary clay found only at the bottom of the Valley River. This river was located 5 miles away and 2,000 feet down the steep cliff from where the cabin stood. The river had been frozen solid under 18 inches of ice for the entire month leading up to the disappearance. There was no logical way for hundreds of pounds of wet river bottom clay to end up inside a chimney on the ridge. The forensic team also processed the interior of the cabin for fingerprints and DNA evidence that might explain the intruder. They found no foreign DNA in the cabin, and the only fingerprints belonged to Silas Thorne and the rescue team members. However, the team found a series of disturbing marks on the wooden ceiling beams directly above the center of the room. The marks were indentations in the wood that looked like they were made by human hands pressing upward with immense pressure. The size of the hands was significantly larger than an average human, and the fingers were long and incredibly thin. The pressure required to make such marks in solid pine beams would exceed the strength of any living person or animal. The team also noted that there were no ladder marks or furniture scratches on the floor beneath the ceiling prints. It was as if someone or something had floated up to the ceiling and pressed against the wood with crushing force. The investigation expanded to include a review of historical cases in the same sector of the National Forest Archives. A junior archivist discovered a dusty file from 1972 involving another lookout named Edward Haynes. Edward had vanished from a tower less than a mile from where Silas Thorne lived, and the details were strikingly similar. The report from 1972 stated that Edward's tower was found with the door open and the radio smashed. The investigating sheriff at the time noted the presence of wet gray mud smeared on the windows and the floor of the tower. Edward was never found, and the case was closed as an accidental death due to exposure to the elements. Another file from 1954 described a team of loggers who abandoned their camp on the Devil Ridge overnight. The foreman claimed that the woods became too quiet, and he saw blue lights floating in the trees near the camp. He reported that his men started acting strange and hearing voices calling their names from the darkness of the heavy timber. The logging company dismissed the crew, and the camp was reclaimed by the forest and eventually rotted away into the ground. The search for Silas Thorne continued for 3 weeks with the help of cadaver dogs and aerial drones with thermal cameras. The dogs picked up a scent trail that led from the cabin door to the edge of the steep cliff face. The trail ended abruptly at the precipice, as if Silas had simply stepped off into the empty air of the canyon. The drones scanned the valley floor and the frozen river below, but found no sign of a body or any clothing. The medical examiner suggested that the extreme cold and the scavenging animals would leave very little evidence after so much time. However, the lack of any physical trace left the family and the community with no closure and many unanswered questions. The official conclusion was that Silas suffered a mental break and wandered into the storm, where he succumbed to hypothermia. The strange evidence of the clay and the bent spoon was omitted from the final public statement to avoid panic. The cabin on Devil Ridge was boarded up by the Forest Service, and the trail leading to it was officially closed. Hikers who trespass in that area often report feeling a sudden drop in temperature even during the summer months. Some witnesses claim to see a figure standing on the edge of the cliff, watching them with a dark and intense stare. A group of campers in 2023 reported hearing a digital voice recorder clicking on and off in the woods. They said the voice sounded like an old man reading weather coordinates and warning them to stay away from the trees. The Forest Service has denied these reports and insists that the area is safe, but they refuse to reopen the trail. The mystery of the frozen cabin remains one of the most baffling cold cases in the history of the region. The combination of the audio tapes and the physical impossibility of the clay suggests something far stranger than a storm. The mountain has a way of keeping its own counsel, and silence is often the only answer it gives to our questions. Silas Thorne spent his life watching the forest, and in the end, the forest decided to watch him back. The empty cabin stands as a monument to the things we do not understand and the boundaries we should not cross. The files on the desk of the sheriff are now collecting dust, but the story of the blue lights persists in the valley. Locals advise visitors to stay on the main roads and never to answer if they hear their name called in the woods. The legend of the Clayman has become a cautionary tale for children who want to play too deep in the forest. It serves as a grim reminder that civilization is just a thin shell that protects us from the wild and the unknown. When the wind blows from the north, you can hear the timber groaning under the weight of the snow and the history. The truth of what happened to Silas Thorne is likely frozen somewhere in the ice of the river or the heart of the mountain. We may never know what walked onto that porch or why it left the door open for the snow to enter. All we have are the recordings of a man who was brave enough to stay at his post until the very end. In this new story, you can't outrun the cold in these mountains. The wilderness of the northern Rockies is a place of breathtaking beauty that hides a cruel and indifferent nature. It is a landscape where the weather can turn from a sunny afternoon to a whiteout blizzard in minutes. In the winter of 2023, a seasoned utility contractor named Tobias Craig uncovered a grim mystery in this frozen world. What he found in a remote relay station would eventually explain the disappearance of two men who were complete strangers. The official case file describes a tragedy of paranoia and proximity that is almost impossible to believe. The events of that week proved that the most dangerous thing in the forest is not always the cold. Tobias was a man who had spent 40 years working on the high-voltage lines that crisscrossed the state. He was accustomed to the biting wind and the silence that draped over the mountains during the winter months. On a Tuesday in early February, he was assigned a ticket to service the backup generator at the Blackwood Ridge station. The station was a small cabin that housed essential communication equipment and a living space for temporary maintenance crews. It had been occupied for the last 2 weeks by a contract technician named Miles Coven. Miles was supposed to check in with dispatch every morning at 8, but he had missed 2 consecutive calls. The journey up to the ridge was slow and treacherous as Tobias navigated his heavy snowcat over the buried service road. The treads of the machine crunched over the hard-packed snow, and the engine roared against the thin mountain air. Tobias watched the tree line for any sign of movement, but the forest was still and lifeless under the ice. He reached the summit just after noon, and the station came into view against a backdrop of gray clouds. The first thing he noticed was that the chimney of the cabin was dark and smokeless. The second thing he saw was the heavy steel door of the cabin swinging wildly in the wind. He parked the snowcat near the woodshed and killed the engine to let the silence of the peak wash over him. The only sound was the rhythmic banging of the unlatched door hitting the frame and the whistle of the wind. Tobias grabbed his heavy flashlight and his radio from the passenger seat and stepped out into the freezing air. He walked toward the cabin with a sense of dread pooling in his stomach and called out for Miles. There was no answer from the dark interior of the structure, and the snow on the porch was drifted high. He stepped across the threshold, and the beam of his light cut through the gloom to reveal a chaotic scene. The interior of the cabin was frozen solid, and the temperature inside felt even colder than the air outside. A plate of food sat on the small wooden table, and it was covered in a layer of frost. The wood stove in the corner was cold to the touch, and the ash box was full to the brim. The cot against the wall was unmade, and the sleeping bag was twisted as if someone had left in a hurry. Tobias scanned the room for any sign of a struggle, but the furniture was upright and in its place. It looked as though the occupant had simply vanished in the middle of a meal and left the door wide open. Tobias walked over to the desk where the station logbook lay open next to a portable weather radio. He picked up the book and began to read the entries that Miles had written over the last 2 weeks. The early pages were standard reports on fuel levels and signal strength and the weather conditions on the ridge. But the tone of the writing began to change around the 10th day of the rotation. Miles wrote about hearing strange scratching noises that seemed to come from the walls or the floor at night. He described a feeling of being watched and a sensation of cold drafts that defied the roaring fire. The entries from the final 3 days painted a picture of a man who was slowly losing his grip on reality. Miles claimed that food was going missing from the pantry and that his tools were being moved around the room. He wrote that he could hear breathing when the wind died down and that he was afraid to sleep. The final entry was scrawled in a shaky hand and simply said that the intruder was inside the room. Tobias closed the book and looked around the empty cabin with a fresh wave of unease running down his spine. He wondered if the isolation had caused Miles to suffer from a breakdown and flee into the woods. He stepped back out onto the porch and began to circle the cabin to look for footprints in the snow. The wind had scrubbed away most of the surface details, but he found a set of deep indentations near the stairs. The tracks led away from the safety of the cabin and headed directly toward the steep drop of the eastern slope. Tobias followed the trail for 300 yards until he reached the edge of the tree line where the snow was deeper. It was there that he found the body of Miles Coven partially buried in a drift near a large spruce tree. The discovery was shocking, not just because of the death, but because of the condition of the body. Miles was wearing only a thin thermal shirt and his socks, despite the freezing temperatures of the storm that had passed. His heavy parka and his boots were found 50 feet back up the trail as if he had discarded them. Tobias knew about the phenomenon of paradoxical undressing, where hypothermia causes a victim to feel intensely hot. It seemed like a clear case of a man who had snapped mentally and run out into the cold to die. But something about the scene did not sit right with Tobias as he marked the location with a flag. He returned to the cabin to call in the situation to the sheriff and to secure the site for the coroner. He closed the heavy door and latched it tight before turning his attention back to the cold wood stove. He decided to light a fire to warm the space up while he waited for the authorities to arrive. He knelt on the floor and reached for the kindling box, but stopped when he felt a distinct draft of air. The cold breeze was coming from the floorboards directly in front of the stove where the rug had been kicked aside. Tobias shone his light on the floor and noticed that two of the wide pine planks were slightly misaligned. He pulled his multi-tool from his belt and wedged the flat head of the screwdriver between the boards to pry them up. The wood groaned and popped as the nails gave way, and he lifted the section of the floor to reveal a dark space. The smell that drifted up from the hole was a mix of unwashed humanity and stale food that made him gag. He pointed his flashlight into the crawl space and saw a makeshift nest constructed from insulation and stolen blankets. And in the center of the nest was the curled-up body of a second man who was also frozen solid. The investigation that followed in the weeks after the discovery would piece together a story that was stranger than fiction. The man under the floor was identified as a fugitive named Silas Vane, who had been on the run for months. He had broken into the crawl space of the cabin before the winter season began and had been living there in secret. He had survived by siphoning heat from the wood stove above and stealing food when Miles was asleep or outside. He had drilled small holes in the floorboards to let the warmth of the fire filter down into his hiding spot. The scratching noises that Miles had reported in the logbook were likely Silas moving around in the cramped space below. The breathing he heard was the sound of the fugitive sleeping just inches beneath his feet. The missing food and the moved tools were not the result of a haunting, but the desperate acts of a starving man. It became clear that Miles had not been hallucinating, but had been reacting to a very real presence in his home. The tragedy was that he never realized the intruder was a person and not a supernatural force or a delusion. The reconstruction of the final night suggested that Silas had made a mistake and alerted Miles to his presence. Perhaps he had coughed or knocked against the floorboards loud enough to be heard over the wind. Miles had panicked and believed that the monster was finally coming for him, and he had bolted for the door. In his terror, he had run out into the storm without his gear and succumbed to the elements within hours. The open door was the detail that sealed the fate of the man left behind in the crawl space. When Miles ran, he left the door wide open, and the brutal winter wind had rushed into the cabin instantly. The fire in the wood stove would have burned out quickly or been extinguished by the drafting wind. With the heat source gone, the crawl space turned into an icebox within a matter of minutes. Silas was trapped in his narrow hole with no way to exit quickly and no heavy clothing to protect him. He had frozen to death in his hiding spot while the man he had been haunting froze to death in the woods. The medical examiner confirmed that both men had died within hours of each other on that same dark night. The fugitive had been leeching the life and warmth from the technician until the very end. It was a parasitic relationship that ended in mutual destruction when the host finally fled the environment. Tobias often thought about the irony of the two men dying so close to each other, yet so far apart. They had shared the same roof and the same heat source for weeks without ever seeing each other's faces. The cabin at Blackwood Ridge was cleaned out, and the floorboards were replaced, but the story lingered in the local community. The utility company eventually tore the structure down and replaced it with a fully automated system that required no human presence. They said it was for efficiency, but everyone knew it was because no one wanted to work the night shift there. The idea of sleeping in a room where someone might be listening from below was too much to bear. It became a cautionary tale for the new hires about the importance of checking every corner of a remote site. Tobias retired from the field a year later and spent his time fishing in the valleys where the sun stayed warm. He never forgot the image of the nest under the floor and the stolen blankets that made up a bed. It was a stark reminder of how desperate a person can become when they are trying to outrun the law. Silas Vane had thought he found the perfect hiding spot where the snow would cover his tracks forever. He had traded his freedom for a cold grave beneath the floor of a stranger's house. The file on the case was closed, with a ruling of accidental death by hypothermia for both individuals involved. The sheriff remarked that it was a one-in-a-million situation that would likely never happen again. But for Tobias, the case was not about the odds, but about the fragility of the human mind. Miles Coven had been a rational and capable man who was driven to madness by sounds he could not explain. He had been right about the danger, but wrong about the source, and that mistake cost him his life. The wilderness has a way of stripping away the layers of civilization and revealing the raw instincts of survival. In the end, both men were just animals trying to stay warm in a world that wanted them frozen. The mountains do not care about justice or guilt or the reasons why a man might hide in the dark. They only care about the temperature and the wind and the relentless passage of time. And on that ridge in February, the cold won the race against both the innocent and the guilty. There are still nights when Tobias wakes up and listens to the settling of his own house in the quiet hours. He listens for the scratch of a nail against wood or the soft exhale of a breath that is not his own. He knows that it is just the house cooling down after a long day, but the memory is hard to shake. We all like to believe that we are safe in our homes and that we are alone when we lock the door. But the story of the cabin is a whisper that says we might never truly know what lies beneath the floor. The equipment from the cabin was auctioned off and the logs were hauled away to be used for firewood in the valley. The only thing that remains on the ridge is a concrete slab that is slowly being reclaimed by the moss. Hikers who pass by the spot often stop to rest and admire the view without knowing what happened there. They sit on the concrete and eat their lunch while the ghost of the station sleeps beneath them. The wind still howls through the trees and tries to tell the story to anyone who will listen. It serves as a grim testament to the fact that fear can be just as deadly as the freezing cold. Miles ran from a fear that he built up in his mind until it became a monster he could not fight. If he had just looked under the rug, he might have found a man instead of a demon. He might have been able to handle an intruder where he could not handle the unknown. But fear is the enemy of reason, and in the isolation of the mountains, reason is the only thing that keeps you alive. The legacy of the discovery is a new protocol for all the rangers and workers who head out to the remote posts. They are now required to inspect the substructures of every building before they settle in for their shift. It is a small change, but one that carries the weight of 2 lives that were lost for nothing. The cold will always be there waiting for a mistake or a moment of weakness. But now, at least the people who work the high lines know to check the floor before they close their eyes. You can never be too careful when you are alone in a place where the nearest help is hours away. The mind plays tricks in the silence, and the shadows can stretch into shapes that look like threats. But sometimes the threat is real, and it is hiding in the one place you never thought to look. The mountains keep their secrets well, but sometimes they give one up to teach us a lesson. And the lesson from Blackwood Ridge is that you can't outrun the cold if you bring it with you. Divers found something disturbing in this deep lake. The glacial waters of Lake Pend Oreille in northern Idaho are utilized by the United States Navy for acoustic testing due to the immense depth and silence of the trench. A team of 3 contracted specialists arrived at the southern shore on September 12, 2023, to retrieve a sunken sensory array that had malfunctioned during a storm. The team was led by 45-year-old master diver Elias Thorne, who had spent 20 years working on deep-sea oil rigs in the North Sea before moving to freshwater operations. He was accompanied by 38-year-old technical operator Sarah Jenkins and a 30-year-old support diver named Michael Ross, who was training for advanced certifications. Their objective was to descend to a depth of 800 feet using a pressurized diving bell to secure a lift cable to the lost equipment. Dispatch logs from the contracting agency confirm that the weather conditions were calm and the surface water temperature was a mild 60 degrees Fahrenheit. The operation began at 0600 hours with a safety briefing on the support barge that was anchored directly over the target coordinates. Elias reviewed the sonar scans, which showed the sensory array resting on a narrow shelf of granite that jutted out from the main trench wall. The dive plan required Elias and Michael to exit the bell at depth, while Sarah monitored their life support systems and communications from the surface control room. The descent was scheduled to take 30 minutes to allow for proper pressurization and to avoid any physiological stress on the divers. State records indicate that the diving bell was an older model that had recently passed a rigorous safety inspection in Seattle. The team entered the bell and the hatch was sealed tight as the winch operator began lowering them into the dark water. The sunlight faded completely once the bell passed the 200-foot mark, leaving the interior illuminated only by the soft red glow of the instrument panels. Elias watched the depth gauge tick steadily upward, while Michael checked the rebreather packs that they would wear during the excursion. The communication line to the surface remained clear, and Sarah provided updates on the sonar readings, which showed no large obstructions in their path. At 600 feet, the temperature outside the bell dropped to 38 degrees, causing condensation to form on the thick viewport glass. Elias wiped the glass with his gloved hand and peered out into the abyss, but the powerful external lights barely penetrated the gloom. He later noted in the mission log that the water appeared unusually turbid for that specific depth. The bell reached the target depth of 800 feet at 0645 and settled gently onto the granite shelf near the coordinates of the lost array. Sarah confirmed over the radio that the sonar showed the equipment was located 50 feet to the north of their landing site. Elias and Michael donned their helmets and performed a final seal check before equalizing the pressure in the airlock to exit the bell. The heavy steel doors swung open, and the two divers stepped out into the crushing pressure of the deep lake environment. Their umbilical cables trailed behind them like lifelines connecting them to the safety of the bell and the infinite supply of mixed gas. The visibility was less than 10 feet, and the silt on the shelf was easily disturbed by their fins. Elias took the lead, carrying the heavy steel cable that needed to be attached to the lifting eye of the sensory array. Michael followed closely behind with a handheld sonar unit to help guide them through the murky water toward the target signal. They moved slowly to conserve energy and to prevent carbon dioxide buildup in their helmets, which can be fatal at such extreme depths. After 10 minutes of walking along the granite shelf, Michael stopped and signaled for Elias to hold his position. Michael's voice crackled over the comms, reporting that he was picking up a second metallic signature directly ahead of them. This was unexpected because the survey maps provided by the Navy showed only the sensory array in that sector. The divers approached the source of the second signal with caution, fearing it might be unexploded ordnance or debris from historical testing. As they moved closer, the shape of a large rectangular structure emerged from the darkness, illuminated by their helmet lights. It was not the sensory array they were looking for, but rather a shipping container that looked heavily modified. The metal sides were reinforced with additional steel plates, and there were thick glass portholes welded along the side facing the trench. Elias reported the find to Sarah on the surface, who immediately checked the hazard logs for any record of a sunken container. She replied that there were no records of any lost cargo or structures in that specific grid square dating back to 1950. Elias moved closer to the container and wiped the silt away from one of the glass portholes to look inside the structure. He expected to see water or perhaps crates of expired military surplus that had been dumped illegally years ago. Instead, his light revealed a dry interior that was fitted with a small bunk and a table bolted to the floor. There was a mug sitting on the table and a stack of papers that looked pristine and unaffected by the humidity. The site was impossible because the pressure at 800 feet would have crushed a standard container instantly. This structure was clearly pressurized and designed to maintain a livable atmosphere deep underwater. Elias felt a cold knot of dread in his stomach as he realized the air inside the container was likely fresh. Michael circled around to the other side of the structure and found a heavy hatch that was secured from the inside with a large wheel mechanism. He radioed Elias and pointed out a thick black cable running from the base of the container down into the deeper abyss of the trench. The cable was not covered in algae or sediment, which suggested it had been installed relatively recently. Elias ordered Michael to back away from the structure and to focus on finding the sensory array so they could leave. However, Michael paused and told Elias that he thought he saw movement inside the container through one of the rear portholes. Elias dismissed this as a trick of the light caused by nitrogen narcosis and insisted they return to the mission objectives immediately. The divers located the sensory array 50 yards past the strange container and quickly secured the lifting cable to the main hook. The work was physically demanding, and their breathing rates increased significantly as they struggled with the heavy rigging. While they worked, Elias kept glancing back toward the container, half expecting to see the hatch opening. The silence of the lake was broken only by the rhythmic hissing of their regulators and the hum of the rebreathers. Suddenly, a loud metallic clang echoed through the water, causing both divers to freeze in place. The sound was distinct and mechanical, like a hammer striking a steel plate with significant force. Sarah called down from the surface, asking if they had dropped a tool or hit the bell. Elias replied that they were stationary and had not made the noise, which seemed to originate from the direction of the container. He ordered Michael to abandon the secondary survey and to head back to the bell immediately for extraction. They retraced their steps along the granite shelf, moving as fast as safety protocols allowed. As they passed the container again, Elias shone his light into the porthole one last time. He saw that the mug on the table was now knocked over, and a chair was lying on its side. This detail confirmed that something inside the structure had moved in the 10 minutes they were gone. Panic began to set in, and Elias grabbed Michael's harness to urge him toward the safety of the airlock. The divers scrambled into the bell and sealed the heavy door behind them before initiating the flushing sequence to clear the water. Once the interior was dry, they removed their helmets and sat panting on the benches while the bell began its slow ascent. Elias grabbed the hardline phone to speak directly to the surface supervisor and report the unauthorized habitat. The supervisor listened quietly and then told Elias that the sonar logs showed no structure at that location. He suggested that the divers were suffering from hallucinations induced by high-pressure nervous syndrome. Elias argued angrily, citing the physical details of the table and the cable, but the supervisor remained dismissive. The ascent required several decompression stops to allow the nitrogen to off-gas safely from their tissues. During the stop at 300 feet, the bell suddenly jolted violently, as if something had grabbed the lift cable. The bell swung like a pendulum in the dark water, causing equipment to crash to the floor. Sarah screamed over the intercom that the winch load sensor had spiked to 20 tons for a split second. The cable held the weight, and the bell stabilized after a few terrifying moments of oscillation. Elias looked out the viewport but saw nothing but black water and the rising bubbles from the pressure relief valves. He noted in the log that the impact felt deliberate, rather than a current or a mechanical slip. The team surfaced 2 hours later and exited the bell onto the deck of the barge under the bright afternoon sun. They were immediately debriefed by a pair of Navy officers who had arrived by speedboat while the divers were underwater. The officers confiscated the helmet, camera footage, and the dive logs, citing national security concerns regarding the sensory array. Elias tried to explain about the container and the movement inside, but the officers simply nodded and told him to forget it. They claimed that the area was a dumping ground for classified test shells and visual identification was unreliable. The officers left the barge with the hard drives and the physical logs, leaving the crew with no evidence. Elias and Michael were paid their full contract rate plus a bonus for hazard pay and were asked to sign non-disclosure agreements. Michael quit the diving profession shortly after the incident and moved back to his hometown in Ohio. He told his brother that he still has nightmares about the chair lying on its side in the dry room. He is convinced that someone was living down there in the dark and that they were not happy about being found. Elias continued to work, but he refused to take any further contracts on Lake Pend Oreille. He spent months researching the history of the lake and found obscure references to deep-water habitation experiments in the 70s. A local fisherman contacted Elias a year later, claiming to have snagged his net on a large obstruction in that same area. The fisherman said that when he pulled the net up, it was torn to shreds and covered in a strange black slime. He also mentioned hearing a low-frequency hum vibrating through the hull of his boat before the net broke. This account aligns with the cable Elias saw running down into the trench, which may have been a power line. The depth of the trench goes down to over 1,000 feet, which provides ample room to hide things. The existence of a pressurized environment at 800 feet implies technology that far exceeds standard salvage capabilities. The footage from the helmet cameras has never surfaced in any official report or Freedom of Information request. The Navy maintains that the mission was a routine recovery of a passive listening device. However, the dispatch logs from the barge show a gap of 4 hours where no entries were made. This gap corresponds perfectly with the time the officers were on board and the subsequent debriefing. The lack of documentation makes it impossible to prove what the divers saw that day. The only record is the memory of the overturned cup and the feeling of being watched. Some conspiracy theorists suggest that the lake is home to a secret submarine base or a biological research station. They point to the unusual depth and the government restrictions on certain zones as proof of covert activity. Others argue that it was an illegal drug smuggling operation using a submersible habitat to hide product. But the logistics of building such a structure without detection are nearly impossible. The most unsettling theory is that the habitat was not built by humans at all, but was found there. This theory is often dismissed as ridiculous, but the divers know what they saw in the porthole. Elias Thorne passed away in 2025 from a sudden cardiac event while working in his garage. His autopsy report noted high levels of stress hormones, but otherwise he was in good health for his age. Among his personal effects was a hand-drawn map of the lake with a red X marking the spot of the container. He had written a note on the back of the map that simply said, "Do not go back." The coordinates on the map match a location where the bottom drops away into a jagged crevasse. Sonar scans of that area are notoriously difficult to read due to the steep angles of the rock walls. The mystery of the container in Lake Pend Oreille remains unsolved and likely will never be investigated again. The waters are too deep and the government control is too tight for amateur explorers to verify the claim. The structure sits there in the silent dark, waiting for the next accidental visitor to stumble upon it. Whether it is empty or occupied is a question that haunts anyone who hears the story. The truth is buried under 800 feet of cold water and layers of redacted paperwork. The final voicemail she left remains a mystery. The dense coniferous forests of the Olympic Peninsula in Washington state are known for their breathtaking beauty and their oppressive isolation during the winter months. Clara Mitchell was a 29-year-old freelance architect based in Seattle who specialized in designing sustainable off-grid housing. She had rented a remote cabin near the Hoh Rainforest for a 10-day solo retreat starting on November 10, 2023. Her objective was to finalize the blueprints for a major client without the distractions of the city and to hike the local trails for inspiration. Clara was an experienced outdoorswoman who had hiked portions of the Pacific Crest Trail and was known by her friends as cautious and highly prepared. Dispatch logs from the Jefferson County Sheriff Office confirmed that she arrived at the rental property on schedule and checked in with the property management company via a landline application. The cabin was located 5 miles down a private gravel road that was prone to washing out during heavy rains. The rental property was a 2-story A-frame structure built in the late 70s that sat on a bluff overlooking a dense valley of hemlock and cedar trees. It was equipped with a satellite internet connection and a backup generator, but cell service in the area was notoriously spotty. Clara established a routine during her first 4 days, which involved working on her laptop in the mornings and hiking in the afternoons before the sunset. She communicated daily with her younger brother David, who lived in Portland, ensuring him that she was safe and productive. David later provided investigators with screenshots of their text messages, which showed Clara in high spirits, sending photos of the foggy landscape. The weather reports for the region indicate that a severe storm front moved in on the evening of November 14th, bringing 60-mile-per-hour winds and torrential downpours. The last confirmed text message from Clara was sent at 19:45 hours that night, stating that the power was flickering. The storm intensified throughout the night of the 14th and continued into the following morning, knocking out power lines and blocking several access roads with fallen timber. David attempted to call Clara on the morning of November 15th, but his calls went straight to voicemail, which he assumed was due to the weather. He was not immediately alarmed because Clara had warned him that the satellite connection might go down during the storm. However, his concern grew when 24 hours passed without any word from his sister. He contacted the property management firm on the afternoon of November 16th and asked them to perform a welfare check on the cabin. The management company stated that they could not send a caretaker out until the county road crews had cleared the debris from the main highway. State records show that the road was not deemed passable until the morning of November 17th. David received a voicemail from Clara's number at exactly 3:42 in the morning on November 17th while he was asleep. He did not see the notification until he woke up at 6 in the morning and saw the missed call on his screen. The voicemail was 45 seconds long, and the audio quality was heavily distorted by static and digital compression artifacts. David listened to the message and was immediately struck by the tone of Clara's voice, which sounded breathless and terrified. She was whispering urgently into the microphone, and the background noise suggested she was outside in the wind. The transcript of the voicemail, which was later analyzed by audio forensic experts, contains several disjointed phrases that have never been fully explained. Clara can be heard saying they are on the roof, followed by a sound that resembles metal dragging across wet pavement. The most disturbing part of the voicemail occurs at the 20-second mark, when Clara suddenly stops whispering and goes silent for 10 seconds. The silence is broken by a loud mechanical thrumming sound that vibrates the microphone diaphragm, causing the audio to clip. Clara then speaks her final words, which were transcribed as, "Don't let them inside," before the call abruptly disconnects. David called the Jefferson County Sheriff Office immediately after hearing the message and reported his sister as a missing person in distress. He forwarded the voicemail file to the dispatch center and drove 4 hours north to the peninsula to join the search. Deputies arrived at the cabin at 10:30 in the morning on November 17th, finding the gate to the private road open. The responding officers approached the cabin with caution and noted that Clara's Subaru Outback was parked in the driveway, covered in a layer of pine needles. The vehicle was locked, and her purse, along with her wallet and keys, were found on the passenger seat. This discovery immediately escalated the situation because it suggested that Clara had not left the property in her vehicle. The officers found the front door of the cabin locked and had to use a master key provided by the management company to gain entry. The interior of the cabin was dark and cold as the heating system had shut down when the propane tank ran empty. Investigators found a half-eaten meal of pasta on the dining table, which had begun to mold, indicating it had been sitting there for days. There were no signs of a struggle in the main living area, and Clara's laptop was open on the coffee table. A search of the upstairs sleeping loft revealed that the bed had been slept in, but the sheets were tangled as if someone had exited in a hurry. The window facing the rear of the property was unlatched and slightly open, allowing rain to soak the carpet near the sill. Deputies found a single muddy boot print on the floor directly beneath the window, but the tread did not match any of the footwear Clara owned. The print was photographed and measured, but it was too smeared to provide a definitive shoe size or brand. The investigators then swept the exterior of the cabin and found that the crawlspace access panel had been removed and was lying in the mud. A flashlight beam directed into the crawlspace revealed nothing but damp earth and insulation hanging from the floor joists. The timeline of the voicemail became the central focus of the investigation because it contradicted the physical evidence found at the scene. The medical examiner, who later consulted on the case, estimated that the pasta on the table had been cooked on the evening of November 14th. This suggested that whatever happened to Clara took place 3 days before the voicemail was sent to David. Technical analysis of the cell tower data revealed that Clara's phone had pinged a tower 12 miles away from the cabin at the time the call was made. This tower was located on the other side of a steep ridge that was inaccessible by vehicle. The triangulation data placed the phone deep within a ravine that was known for its treacherous terrain and lack of hiking trails. Search and rescue teams were deployed to the ravine coordinates on November 18th using cadaver dogs and drones equipped with thermal imaging cameras. The terrain was incredibly difficult to navigate due to the dense undergrowth and the slippery mud caused by the recent storm. The team searched for 3 days without finding any trace of Clara or her clothing. On the fourth day of the search, a volunteer found a shattered smartphone lying on a mossy rock near a creek bed. The phone was confirmed to be Clara's device, but it had been smashed with significant force. The battery had been ejected and was found 10 feet away, submerged in the water. The damage to the phone made it impossible to retrieve any local data, but the SIM card was intact. The recovery of the phone raised a baffling technical question for the investigators and the telecommunications experts. If the phone was smashed and the battery was ejected, it should have been impossible for it to make a call. However, the call log from the service provider clearly showed an outbound call to David's number at 3:42 in the morning on November 17th. Experts suggested that the phone might have been destroyed after the call was made, but the location of the debris field suggested it had been there for days. Another theory proposed was that the call data was delayed due to the network outage and the voicemail was actually recorded days earlier. However, the metadata on the voicemail file itself was timestamped to the 17th, which ruled out a network delay. The audio of the voicemail was sent to a private lab for enhancement to isolate the background noises. The lab report stated that the mechanical thrumming sound was consistent with a large industrial fan or a turbine engine. This finding was perplexing because there were no industrial facilities or wind turbines within a 50-mile radius of the cabin. The sound of metal dragging was analyzed and determined to be consistent with a heavy chain being pulled over stone. David became obsessed with the audio and claimed that he could hear a second voice in the background if he turned the volume up. He insisted that right before the call ended, a deep voice whispered the word "open," but the official police transcript lists this as inconclusive static. Detectives interviewed the maintenance worker who had serviced the cabin's generator 2 weeks prior to Clara's arrival. The man was a 50-year-old local resident with a history of minor theft charges. He provided an alibi, stating that he was at a bar in Port Angeles on the night of the 14th, and his presence was corroborated by credit card receipts. However, a witness who lived on the main road reported seeing a gray van matching the worker's vehicle turning onto the private road on November 16th. The maintenance worker denied returning to the property and claimed the witness was mistaken about the date. Police searched his vehicle and home, but found no physical evidence linking him to Clara's disappearance. The investigation stalled in early 2024 due to a lack of actionable leads and the deteriorating weather conditions in the mountains. The case was classified as a missing person with suspicious circumstances, but no homicide warrant was ever issued. The prevailing theory among law enforcement was that Clara had suffered a mental health crisis or a medical emergency that caused her to wander into the woods. They theorized that she might have survived in the ravine for several days before succumbing to hypothermia. This theory, however, failed to explain the muddy boot print in the loft or the impossible timing of the phone call. The family hired a private investigator to continue the search, but the trail had gone cold. Some locals in the area have long shared stories about the ridge where the phone was found, calling it a place where the sound carries in strange ways. There are archived reports from the 1990s of hikers hearing mechanical grinding noises in that specific valley. Geologists have surveyed the area and found no seismic activity or underground caverns that would account for such acoustic anomalies. The unexplained sounds on the voicemail have fueled internet speculation but provided no comfort to the family. David continues to listen to the voicemail, hoping to decipher a clue that everyone else has missed. He believes that Clara was running from someone or something that night, and that the phone was planted in the ravine to mislead the search parties. The cabin remains a rental property, but the management company has installed bars on the lower windows and upgraded the security system. Renters who have stayed there since the incident have reported no unusual activity other than the occasional power outage. The mystery of how a dead phone could make a call and who made the muddy boot print in the loft remains unsolved. The file on Clara Mitchell sits in a box in the county archives filled with conflicting data points and unanswered questions. The final voicemail she left stands as the only testament to her last moments in the dark, rainy woods. To this day, no remains have ever been found, and the forest has kept it secret.